She found the letter on a quiet afternoon that didn't feel important at first. The kind of afternoon that arrives without announcement, when the world seems to slow down just enough for memories to catch up. The light came through the window in a soft, dusty way, touching the corners of the room but not quite warming it. She had been cleaning, or maybe just pretending to clean, opening drawers she hadn't opened in years, touching objects she no longer remembered owning. It was meant to be a simple task. It turned into something else entirely. The letter was tucked inside a small box at the back of the closet. The box was old, its edges worn down, the lid slightly warped from time and humidity. She recognized it immediately, though she couldn't remember the last time she had seen it. Her hands hesitated before opening it, as if some part of her already knew what waited inside. There are moments when the body remembers before the mind does. This was one of them. Inside the box were things she hadn't thought about in years. A faded photograph, a ticket stub, a pressed flower that had long since lost its color. And then, at the bottom, folded carefully, once, twice, 3 times, was the letter. She didn't need to read the name written on the envelope to know who it was for. The paper itself felt familiar, thinner than she remembered, fragile in a way that matched how she had felt when she wrote it. Her breath grew shallow as she unfolded it slowly, the sound of paper against paper louder than it should have been in the quiet room. She had written it years ago, in another life, it felt like, a version of herself who believed that words could fix what silence had broken, a version of herself who thought that if she just explained enough, loved enough, waited long enough, things would turn out differently. She hadn't sent it. She remembered the night she wrote it with painful clarity. The room had been dark except for the small lamp on her desk. Outside, the city hummed with life that felt distant, unreachable. She had been sitting on the edge of her bed, pen in hand, heart racing, writing as if the page were the only place where she was allowed to be honest. At that time, everything in her life felt unresolved. Conversations left unfinished, feelings swallowed back, questions without answers. And at the center of it all was him, the person who had mattered more than anyone else and yet remained just out of reach. They had known each other for years before things became complicated. At first, it was easy, laughter without effort, comfort without explanation. He had been someone she could talk to about anything, someone who made the world feel less heavy just by being there. She hadn't planned to fall in love with him. It happened quietly, slowly, in the spaces between conversations, in the way she looked forward to hearing his voice, in how his absence felt louder than anyone else's presence. But love, when unspoken, has a way of becoming heavy. It settles into the chest, presses against the ribs, makes every moment feel slightly unfinished. She carried that weight for a long time, convincing herself that it was safer to feel everything silently than to risk losing what they already had. When things finally began to fall apart, it wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, just distance, just pauses where there used to be words, just the slow realization that something important was slipping away, and neither of them seemed to know how to stop it. He had started pulling back, or maybe she only noticed it then. Messages became shorter, calls less frequent, plans postponed and then forgotten. She told herself not to overthink it, told herself she was imagining things, told herself that if she just stayed patient, everything would settle again. It didn't. One evening, after a conversation that felt emptier than usual, she sat alone in her room and felt something inside her finally break. Not loudly, not all at once, just a quiet fracture, like a hairline crack in glass. That was the night she wrote the letter. She wrote about how much he meant to her, about the way he made her feel safe without even trying, about the moments she replayed in her mind when she couldn't sleep. She wrote about the confusion, the fear of saying too much, the fear of saying nothing at all. She admitted things she had never said out loud, things she barely allowed herself to think. She told him she was tired of pretending she didn't feel the way she did. She told him she didn't need promises, just honesty. She told him she would understand if he didn't feel the same, but she needed to know the truth so she could stop living in uncertainty. She cried as she wrote, tears blurring the ink, her hand shaking, her chest aching in a way that felt unbearable and necessary at the same time. By the time she finished, the letter felt like a confession carved straight out of her heart. And then she folded it. She remembered holding it in her hands, staring at it for a long time. The envelope sat on the desk beside her, blank, waiting for a name. She imagined his reaction, his surprise, his silence, his rejection, his understanding. Every possible outcome played out in her mind, each one more frightening than the last. In the end, fear won. She told herself she would send it the next day, then the next, then when she felt braver, when the timing was better, when she was stronger. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually the letter disappeared into the box, and the box disappeared into the closet, and life moved forward the way it always does, whether you are ready or not. Now, years later, standing in the same room but feeling like a different person, she held that letter again. Her fingers traced the creases, the ink faded but still readable. She sat down slowly, as if afraid that standing might cause the past to rush back too quickly. She began to read. The words felt familiar and distant, like hearing her own voice echo back from another time. She could feel the emotions behind every sentence, the urgency, the vulnerability, the hope she had tried so hard to bury. She remembered how it felt to believe that love could be clarified, that honesty could solve everything. As she read, her chest tightened, not with the same pain as before, but with something quieter. Sadness, yes, but also tenderness, compassion for the woman she used to be, sitting alone in the dark, believing that silence was safer than truth. She wondered what would have happened if she had sent it. That question had followed her for years, surfacing in quiet moments, late at night, during long drives, in the pauses between conversations with other people. What if he had read it? What if he had answered? What if everything had changed? She had built entire alternate lives around those questions, imagined futures that never existed. And yet here she was, still standing, still breathing, still moving forward despite everything she thought she needed back then. The letter trembled slightly in her hands as she reached the final lines. She remembered how long she had stared at those words, unsure whether they were too much or not enough. She had signed her name at the bottom, carefully, deliberately, as if that small act made it more real. When she finished reading, she sat in silence for a long time. The room felt heavier, filled with memories that had nowhere to go. Outside, the sounds of life continued, cars passing, voices drifting through open windows, the world moving on without any awareness of the moment unfolding inside her. She folded the letter again, slowly, respectfully, as if acknowledging the weight it once carried. She realized that she wasn't angry at herself for not sending it, not anymore. What she felt instead surprised her. Understanding. She understood why she was afraid, why she had chosen silence, why she had protected herself the only way she knew at the time. She understood that she was doing her best with the emotional tools she had then. That realization didn't erase the regret, but it softened it. She placed the letter back on the table in front of her, resting her hands on either side of it. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel everything without rushing to push it away. The sadness, the warmth, the quiet ache of something unfinished. And as she sat there, she began to notice something else beneath it all. A sense of distance, not coldness, but perspective. The pain that once felt overwhelming now felt contained, like a chapter that had ended even if it never got the closure she once wanted. She realized she didn't need to send the letter anymore, not because it didn't matter, but because its purpose had already been fulfilled. It had been written to release something trapped inside her, and in finding it again, she had finally understood what she had been trying to say all along. She left the letter on the table overnight. She didn't put it back in the box right away. Something about closing it away again felt wrong, like undoing a moment that had taken years to arrive. That night she slept lightly, drifting in and out of dreams that felt stitched together from memory and imagination. Faces appeared and disappeared, conversations replayed with different endings. When she woke before sunrise, the room felt unfamiliar, as if the past had rearranged the present while she slept. She made herself a cup of tea and sat across from the letter again. Morning light revealed details she hadn't noticed the day before. The slight slant of her handwriting when emotion took over. The places where the ink grew darker because she had pressed the pen too hard. It was strange seeing evidence of her younger self so clearly, like meeting someone she used to know very well, but hadn't spoken to in years. Back then, her life had revolved around waiting for messages, waiting for signs, waiting for reassurance that never came in the way she hoped it would. She had built her days around the possibility of him reaching out, around the hope that maybe today would be different. It took her a long time to recognize how small that waiting had made her world. After they drifted apart, she tried to move on the way people often do, by filling the silence with noise. New routines, new people, new distractions. She told herself she was fine. She convinced others too. But the truth was quieter and heavier. She carried unresolved feelings like a shadow, always present, even when the sun was bright. She dated other people. Some were kind, some were careless. Some tried to love her in ways she wasn't ready to receive. She compared them all, unconsciously, to him, not because he was better, but because he was unfinished, and unfinished things have a way of staying with you. There were moments when she almost reached out, a song on the radio, a place they used to go, a random memory triggered by something trivial. Each time her hand hovered over her phone, and each time she pulled back. She told herself enough time had passed, that it wouldn't matter anymore, that reopening old wounds wouldn't help either of them. Years went by like that. Her life, on the surface, looked full. She learned to stand on her own in ways she hadn't before. She built a sense of independence she was proud of. She laughed more easily. She cried less often. She became someone who could sit alone without feeling lonely. And yet, there were nights when the question returned quietly, without warning. What if I had sent the letter? What if I had been braver? Those questions didn't hurt the way they once had, but they lingered, unresolved, like a melody without an ending. Finding the letter again reopened that space, not violently, not all at once, but gently, insistently. It asked her to look at what she had avoided, not to relive it, but to finally understand it. As the day unfolded, she carried the weight of that understanding with her. She went about her routine, but her thoughts kept circling back to the same place. Not to him exactly, but to herself, to the version of her who had been so afraid of saying the wrong thing that she said nothing at all. That afternoon, she sat by the window and let herself remember the moment everything truly shifted between them. It hadn't been a fight. It hadn't even been a clear ending. It was a conversation where she felt him listening less, responding slower, being somewhere else entirely. She remembered hanging up the phone and staring at the wall, feeling a sense of loss she couldn't quite explain yet. That was when the fear began to outweigh the hope. She realized now that she had been waiting for permission back then. Permission to be honest. Permission to want more. Permission to take up emotional space. She believed that love was something you earned by being patient, by being understanding, by asking for as little as possible. No one had ever told her otherwise. Reading the letter again made her see how much of herself she had been willing to hide just to keep someone close, not because he demanded it, but because she didn't believe she deserved to be fully seen. That realization hurt more than the memory of him ever did. She folded the letter once more and held it to her chest, not as a message meant for someone else, but as a reminder of how far she had come. She was no longer that woman waiting in the dark, afraid of her own feelings. She had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that honesty was something not to be ashamed of. Later that evening, she did something she hadn't planned. She opened her laptop and searched for his name. She hadn't looked him up in years. Her heart didn't race the way she expected it to. It beat steadily, grounded, curious rather than desperate. His life had moved forward too. Different city, different people, a different version of himself. Seeing that didn't break her. Instead, it brought a strange sense of calm. It confirmed something she had already begun to feel. Their story belonged to the past. She closed the laptop without reaching out, not because she was afraid, but because she no longer needed to. The letter had answered questions she didn't even know she was still asking. It showed her that the silence between them hadn't been meaningless, it had been formative. That night she took the letter and placed it somewhere new, not hidden away, not forgotten, but not clung to either. It sat in a drawer she opened often, among things that mattered but no longer controlled her. As she lay in bed, she thought about forgiveness, not the dramatic kind that requires confrontation or apologies, but the quiet kind that happens internally, when you stop punishing yourself for not knowing what you know now. She forgave herself for being afraid, for being unsure, for loving deeply without understanding how to protect herself. She forgave herself for believing that silence was safety. And in doing so, she felt something loosen inside her. The letter no longer felt like a regret. It felt like a bridge, one she didn't need to cross anymore, but one that showed her where she had been and why she had become who she was. She realized that healing doesn't always come from answers given by others. Sometimes it comes from listening to the truth you once wrote but weren't ready to read. As sleep finally came, it carried with it a sense of closure she hadn't expected, not because the past had been resolved, but because it had been accepted. The next morning she woke with a lighter chest. The memory of the letter was still there, but it no longer pressed down on her. It sat quietly, like a lesson learned, rather than a mistake made. She went about her day with a renewed awareness of her own voice, of its value, of its strength. She promised herself that she would never again silence her feelings out of fear of losing someone. She understood now that the right people don't leave because you are honest, they leave because they are not meant to stay. The unsent letter had taught her that. And as she moved forward, she carried its message with her, not as a burden, but as a reminder that even the words we never send can still change us. Days passed, and the letter stayed where she had placed it, no longer demanding attention, yet never fully leaving her thoughts. It had shifted something subtle inside her. The way a long-held breath finally released can change the way your body feels without you noticing right away. She found herself paying closer attention to her own reactions, her own patterns, the quiet ways she used to retreat when emotions grew complicated. She noticed how often she still softened her words out of habit, even when honesty would have been easier. How she sometimes smiled through discomfort, choosing peace on the surface instead of truth underneath. These were old instincts, learned early, reinforced over time. The letter had not created them, but it had illuminated them. One evening, while walking home as the sky darkened into a deep blue, she realized that the ache she once associated with him no longer felt personal. It had become symbolic. It represented all the times she had swallowed her needs to preserve connection, all the moments she chose silence because she feared being too much. Understanding this didn't make her bitter, it made her attentive. She remembered a conversation from years ago, one that had seemed insignificant at the time. He had asked her what she wanted, really wanted, and she had laughed it off, changing the subject. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because saying it felt dangerous. She had convinced herself that wanting more would push him away. That memory stayed with her now, not as a regret, but as a marker, a point where she could clearly see the difference between who she had been and who she was becoming. In the weeks that followed, she found herself more willing to speak up, not dramatically, not all at once, but gently and consistently. She expressed when something mattered to her. She admitted when something hurt. She didn't always get the response she hoped for, but she felt something new afterward, a quiet pride in having honored her own truth. There were moments when the past tried to pull her back, a familiar song in a cafe, a dream that placed him in front of her again, unchanged, smiling the way he used to. When she woke from those dreams, she felt the old ache flicker briefly, then fade. She no longer chased it. She let it pass. One afternoon, she took the letter out again, not to read it, but simply to hold it. It felt different in her hands now, lighter, as if the weight it once carried had been distributed elsewhere, into understanding, into growth, into something she could carry without strain. She thought about the woman who wrote it, sitting alone in the dim light, believing that love required self-erasure. She wished she could reach back through time and tell her that love does not ask you to disappear, that honesty is not a threat, that being seen is not something you have to earn by being quiet. But she also knew that she had arrived here because of that version of herself, not despite her. Every moment of hesitation, every unsent word, every tear shed in silence had led her to this place of clarity. That realization marked a turning point she hadn't expected. The story was no longer about what might have been, it was about what had been learned. She stopped framing the letter as a missed opportunity and started seeing it as a private confession that had saved her in ways she didn't understand at the time. Writing it had been an act of courage, even if sending it never happened. It had allowed her to name her feelings, to make them real, even if only on paper. There was healing in that. As time went on, she noticed that her relationships began to change. She gravitated toward people who listened, who welcomed honesty instead of retreating from it. She felt less drawn to emotional uncertainty, less willing to shrink herself to fit into spaces that couldn't hold her fully. She wasn't perfect. She still hesitated sometimes. She still felt fear when vulnerability loomed, but now she recognized those moments for what they were, echoes, not commands. One quiet night, she sat by her window again, much like the night she had written the letter years before. The difference was unmistakable. The room no longer felt heavy. The silence no longer felt threatening. It felt spacious, calm, alive with possibility. She realized then that closure doesn't always come from conversations or explanations. Sometimes it comes from acceptance, from understanding why things unfolded the way they did, and allowing yourself to stop rewriting the past in search of a different ending. The letter had been a doorway she wasn't ready to walk through at the time. Finding it again had shown her that she no longer needed to. She folded it carefully one last time and placed it back in the drawer, not as something unfinished, but as something complete, a chapter closed not by sending words into the world, but by finally listening to them herself. As she turned off the light and prepared for sleep, she felt a deep, steady calm settle in her chest, the kind that comes from not certainty, but from self-trust, from knowing that whatever she faced next, she would meet it with honesty, not silence. The letter she never sent had done its work. The days no longer felt heavy after that. Not perfect, not untouched by memory, but balanced in a way she hadn't experienced before. The kind of balance that comes from understanding yourself rather than trying to control outcomes. She noticed how her body moved through the world differently now, shoulders less tense, breath deeper, thoughts less crowded by what-ifs. The letter became quieter in her mind, not erased, not forgotten, just integrated. It no longer appeared as a question demanding an answer, but as a reminder of a time when she was learning how to feel without permission. There were moments when she caught herself smiling at unexpected times, not because something extraordinary had happened, but because she felt aligned with herself. She began to enjoy the small, ordinary parts of her days more fully, the warmth of sunlight on her skin, the rhythm of her footsteps on familiar streets, the comfort of her own company. Occasionally, someone would ask her about past relationships, and she noticed how her answers had changed. She no longer spoke with hesitation or defensiveness. She didn't minimize her emotions or rush through the story. She spoke calmly, honestly, without needing to justify why something had mattered to her. That shift felt important. She realized that for a long time she had believed that loving deeply was a weakness, that caring too much made you vulnerable in ways that could be used against you. The unsent letter had been proof of that belief, a confession hidden away to avoid rejection. Now she understood that loving deeply was never the problem. The problem had been believing she had to hide it. One evening, while sorting through old belongings, she came across another box filled with remnants of her past. This time, she opened it without fear. She looked at each item with curiosity rather than attachment. Some things still held emotion, others had lost their meaning entirely. She kept what felt relevant and let go of the rest. When she reached the end, she realized something quietly powerful. The letter no longer needed a special place. It didn't need to be protected or preserved. It had already shaped her in the ways it was meant to. She placed it back in the drawer, not as an artifact of regret, but as evidence of growth. Her life continued to unfold in ways she couldn't have predicted back then. New connections formed, new conversations opened, and this time she showed up fully, even when it felt uncomfortable, especially when it felt uncomfortable. She learned that honesty didn't guarantee perfect outcomes, but it guaranteed peace. And peace, she discovered, was far more valuable than certainty. There were moments of vulnerability that still scared her, moments when her voice wavered, when her heart felt exposed. But she stayed. She spoke anyway. She didn't retreat into silence like she used to. Each time she chose honesty, she felt a little stronger. She thought less often about what might have happened if she had sent the letter all those years ago, not because the question no longer existed, but because it no longer mattered. The path her life took had brought her here, to a place of self-respect and clarity she wouldn't trade for a different ending. She understood now that closure is not something another person gives you. It's something you create by accepting your past without rewriting it. The unsent letter had been a mirror. It showed her who she was when she wrote it, and who she had become since. It showed her that even unspoken words can guide us, shape us, teach us how to listen to ourselves. One morning, as she stood by the window watching the world wake up, she felt a deep gratitude for that younger version of herself, for her honesty, for her courage, for writing the letter, even if she never sent it. Because those words had not been wasted. They had lived inside her all this time, quietly pushing her toward truth, toward growth, toward acceptance. And now she was ready to carry that lesson forward, not as a reminder of what she lost, but as a promise to herself, a promise to speak, a promise to choose honesty over fear, a promise to never again silence her own heart for the comfort of someone else. The letter she never sent had finally reached its destination, and it had always been her.